Okay, so whether we are A day or B day students, or were at least, it doesn't really matter. We kind of all need to be on the same page. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is take out your notes packet that is over this first section of evolution. And I want for you to start here at section number 4, artificial selection. If you have nothing written here, this is where you start. If you have artificial selection completed, depending on which class period you were in and what schedule you were on prior to break, skip forward in this video until you find the start of what you need for your notes. So I'm going to start here. You kind of use whatever parts of this video you need to complete your notes packet. Okay, so artificial selection is something very different than natural selection. Artificial selection is when humans select for specific traits instead of allowing the environment to select for those traits. So a great example of that would be present-day dog breeds and the selection process that kind of got us here from wild animals, particularly wolves. There's also a picture down here of wild cabbage and the selective breeding process that occurred to give us all of these other types of vegetables from that wild cabbage: cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, etc. So artificial selection is typically accomplished by a process called selective breeding. And ultimately, what we are trying to do in selective breeding is enhance desirable traits by intentionally and selectively breeding various organisms together. Now, that's great if we have enhanced our desirable traits, but selective breeding, if not really monitored and maintained, can also lead to organisms that have disease or defects due to an inbreeding process. So artificial selection and the process of selective breeding really should be monitored, because we don't want to sort of inbreed our gene pool to the point of genetic issues. Check out this quick video here about dogs.
Dogs are a part of our everyday lives, but how did they evolve into the different breeds we see around us today? To find the answer, we must take a journey back through thousands of years when early humans were hunters and gatherers. As humans hunted, wolves would follow, eating the scraps of food they left behind. Eventually, the humans started hunting with the wolves and sharing food with them.
Basically, over time, humans have sort of allowed dogs to come into their village, and especially if they were helpful, they let them live and breed. And over time, that breeding became more and more sophisticated, so that they were actually choosing dogs that did things that were useful to them, like help them hunt or help them herd their herd animals like sheep or cattle. And so, over time, it's this artificial selection process of humans choosing which animals would live and which ones would breed that leads to the artificial selection and the formation of these different breeds.
Through artificial selection, humans gradually selected the traits they wanted and created the breeds we have today.
So natural selection is just the process of nature deciding which animals survived and which ones reproduced. Well, artificial selection is very much the same, and it leads to evolution in very much the same way, but it's humans that decide which animals live and which animals can breed with each other. But because they've been under artificial selection for so long, they've evolved down these separate evolutionary paths, if you will. And so the dog breeds are still very different, and you can recognize them easily, but we still consider them the same species because they can interbreed with one another.
With their short, water-resistant coats and webbed feet, Labradors were bred as gun dogs and waterfowl retrievers. The dogs that were the most adept swimmers were prized by breeders and therefore were bred to create offspring that were the best at retrieving ducks and other waterfowl that their owners shot. Greyhounds are known for their speed, and they were selectively bred for hunting. Skinny, aerodynamic dogs were able to catch fast prey, and humans continued to breed greyhounds to be skinnier and faster, resulting in the racing dogs that greyhounds are known as today. The Sleeve Pekingese were prized for their tiny size. Members of the Chinese imperial household would take the smallest pup in a litter and then breed it with the smallest pup of another litter. The offspring would then be naturally smaller than the previous generation. This process would be repeated multiple times to create dogs that could be hidden in the spacious sleeves of royals. The Pekingese dog is one of the oldest breeds of dogs, and it is one of the breeds that is most genetically similar to wolves. We can see many differences between modern domestic dog breeds and their wolf ancestors.
Well, the differences can be very subtle because domestic dogs are the descendants of wolves, so they have a lot of the same genes and the same skull elements. But over time, we've selected them to do different things. And so one of the major differences is that the muzzle tends to be longer or shorter in some. The attachment of the muscles that close the jaws can be, stronger in some and weaker in some. And then there's several other different characteristics that change and that are under selection.
So, as you can see, all the various breeds of modern dogs today have come a very long way from their wild wolf ancestors. Through artificial selection, we have managed to turn wild wolves into man's best friend.
All right. So then moving forward in our notes, the next section we've done in class. So everybody should have this slide and all of the parts of the slide. If you missed any of it, you can pause the video and recapture. But we should have this from class. We did some practice. And then we did some more practice. And now we are here. So see if you have Roman numeral 5 in your notes. So let's continue. We talked about in class, we talked about a gene pool and those dominant and recessive alleles. And we know that we can count those dominant and recessive alleles. And over time, those alleles might change. And so this next section of notes would be things or factors that help change or facilitate change within a gene pool. The first factor that could make a gene pool change are mutations. And mutations we know because we have talked about DNA. There are spontaneous mutations, those that really happen seemingly out of nowhere, and there are mutations that are due to errors in the DNA replication process. So either one of those two options for mutations could change the gene pool. Another thing that could change the gene pool is what is called genetic drift. And so in genetic drift, these are changes ultimately that impact the gene pool because of what are called chance events. Something has occurred, it wasn't necessarily intentional, but the gene pool is now different as a result. And so there are two types of genetic drifts. The first is called a bottleneck event. And so that you have this picture in your notes here of a bottleneck event. And what I want you to see is the original population. Check out this first bottle. So this represents the original population. Look at all the variation that exists in that population. There's lots of colors of marbles, lots of differences in the population. Well, this population experiences some sort of kind of traumatic bottleneck event where most of the population dies. And so what we see moving forward here are the individuals that survive. They're kind of shaken out here into this jar. So these are the only surviving individuals from whatever the bottleneck event was. And these individuals now are responsible for interbreeding and creating the new population. Well, because so few survived, whatever alleles they have now in their gene pool, those will be the alleles that will be enhanced in the reestablished population. So look at what the population was in the beginning compared to what it is after the bottleneck event and the kind of new grow out. It's very different. And ultimately what we see in this new population down here, there's way less variation. We're almost completely gone. We don't have any of those yellow marbles. They've almost been eliminated, almost to the point of extinction. And so that's really what we're seeing in a bottleneck event. We have a drastic reduction in the population due to these sort of chance-based events like natural disasters, wildfires, hunting and poaching, overhunting and poaching. And that takes the original population and reduces it down in size and variation. And as a result, when those individuals reproduce, the new population contains less variation. The second type of genetic drift is the founder's event or effect. And so this is a founder's effect right down here. You can see these little butterflies that existed in high variation. We've got yellow and black and white here on this island. Well, a few of them fly over to this landmass, but not all of them, right? And so even if we look at who is sort of transposed over to a new landmass, the white butterfly is completely gone. And so as these now begin to interbreed, that white butterfly won't necessarily be in the population like it was originally. So when individuals from a gene pool move into a new location, reestablish a new gene pool, a lot of times that creates less variation in the newly created gene pool as well. The final thing that affects a gene pool is something called gene flow. And so the difference here between gene flow and genetic drift is that gene flow is not a random event. A lot of times it can be random, but a lot of times it is intentional, as you'll see with humans. So this is when individuals and their alleles leave one gene pool and migrate into another gene pool. Now, for humans, gene flow has increased in the last century significantly because of modern day travel. And so we can very easily pick up and move and sit down our roots in a new place, in a new population, and start to interbreed within that new population. We can take our alleles with us and we can breed into a new gene pool. Now, what ultimately that does is take populations that were really, really different and separated and can sort of homogenize them or make them similar. It actually decreases the variation that exists between populations. So this picture up here of the little beetle, these two populations were very different: green beetles, brown beetles. But because one of the beetles migrates over and starts to interbreed, now we see over time this population would increase in brown and they would be less different compared to initially in the beginning. Now, all of this culminates in the last section of notes: the difference in populations that have a little bit of variation and then populations that have a lot of variation. So look at this right here, population size. So how many individuals in the population is high, and genetic variation is high as well. But look what happens when your population size drops, your genetic variation declines as well. And then if we kind of check out what continues, it's really hard for genetic variation to rebound. So even as the population size increases, the genetic variation, it takes a while to build up variation in your population. And so we know that variation has to exist for natural selection to occur. It is not a great thing to have little variation in your population because that can lead to things like extinctions, mass extinctions. So reducing variation will usually negatively impact a population and also the environment, because we don't live in isolation. We impact and are impacted by our environment. So kind of think larger, think about things like energy use and food chains and food webs. If variation declines, that will, within a population, that can oftentimes impact the environment. So there ends up being, if variation is low, there ends up being less for nature to kind of select for or against in the process of natural selection. It leaves individuals in the population susceptible to diseases that can possibly wipe out the entire population. It can lead to extinctions. So when it comes to variations and ways that we can kind of change our gene pool, so think about the bottleneck effect, reduce variation. That's not a good thing. And genetic drift reduces variation. That's genetic drift in general reduces variation. That's not a good thing. Genetic gene flow reduces variation. That's not always a great thing. So keep in mind that for natural selection and evolution to really have its sort of full potential, we need variation within the population. Okay, when you are done with this, you are done with those notes.